The Revenant docked at 0600 hours, station time, in the grey half-dark of a dying auxiliary bay. The clamps caught with a sound like a fist hitting a wall, one hard concussive thud, and then the umbilicals hissed into place and the corridor seals pressurized with a long mechanical exhale, and Staff Sergeant Marcus Holt was first down the ramp with his kit bag over one shoulder and his rifle slung barrel down because nobody had shot at him yet and he wanted to keep it that way a little longer. Checkpoint Omega was not what the briefing documents had described. The briefing documents had called it a strategic hardpoint installation, which was the kind of language that command used when it wanted soldiers to feel like they were being assigned somewhere important rather than somewhere forgotten. What it actually was a tube. A long pressurized tube about 400 meters end to end, bolted to the side of the Kessler Gate mechanism like a barnacle on the hull of something incomprehensibly larger, with 6 defensive gun emplacements along the outer ring, a central operations room that smelled of recycled air and old coffee, and a reactor core that hummed at a frequency Holt could feel in his back molars. There were no windows. The designers had considered windows and then decided against them, because looking at the Kessler Gate from close range had a documented effect on human cognition that the medical literature described as dysphoric ideation and that soldiers described as making you feel like the universe was looking back. The other 4 came down the ramp behind him. Corporal Issel Daven first, 22 years old, hydraulics engineer by training, currently carrying more ammunition than any sane person would consider necessary and grinning about it. Then Specialist Cade Oren, who had not spoken since they left Meridian Station and who had the flat, behind-their-eyes look of someone doing math problems they hadn't been asked to do. Then Private Tomos Oriogabel, the youngest of them, 19, who was on his second deployment and who had the specific combination of easy confidence and total inexperience that Holt had learned to either love or dread depending on the situation. And last, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has never needed to hurry because nothing has ever been faster than her, Specialist Nix. She had no last name on record. The Coalition Integration Program had given her a designation, NX7, that she had transliterated into the human alphabet herself and declared sufficient. She was a head shorter than Holt and twice as dangerous. Her mother had been Heth-born, which meant that the bone structure beneath her face was subtly wrong by human standards. The orbital ridges heavier, the jaw set slightly wider, the eyes a pale amber that caught light from directions it didn't seem to be coming from. Her father had been a human colonist on Viren 4, which the Heth armada had reduced to atmospheric particulate approximately 6 years ago. She had been off-world when it happened. She had joined humanity's military within a week of learning what remained of her father's settlement. Holt had served with her for 14 months. He trusted her more than he trusted most people he'd known his whole life. "Home sweet home," Daven said, dropping her kit bag and looking around the bay with the expression of someone assessing a used vehicle they've just committed to purchasing. "It's smaller than the schematic," Oren said. "Schematics lie," Nick said, and moved past Holt toward the operations room without waiting to be told. They spent the first hour on orientation. The previous crew, a 4-person maintenance team whose tour had ended 3 days prior, had left the station in good order. Gun emplacements were fueled and calibrated. The sensor array was active and reading clean. The gate mechanism itself was on standby, which meant it was drawing minimal power and making the low thrumming sound that Holt's body registered as a threat even when his mind knew it was normal. He walked the whole length of the tube twice, checked every seal by hand, tested the emergency bulkhead releases in the inner corridor, and then came back to the operations room and read the full briefing package that Command had transmitted to the station's secure terminal. He read it twice. Then he sat very still for approximately 40 seconds. Then he read the relevant section a 3rd time, because he was a thorough man and he did not make assumptions based on incomplete readings. The gate was set to close in 6 hours. Not on his order. Not on any order he could countermand. Command had made the decision, when, the logs did not say, though the timestamp on the authorization protocol was 18 hours old, which meant it had been made before the Revenant had even left Meridian, and had embedded the closing sequence in the station's automated systems with a 2-factor lock that required authorization codes Holt did not have and could not obtain. Because the communications relay between Omega and the nearest Coalition outpost had a 7-hour signal lag in this sector. He could transmit a response right now and the reply would arrive 43 minutes after the gate had already closed. The gate mechanism did not differentiate between voluntary and involuntary occupants. When the field collapsed, it collapsed. Everything inside the aperture radius, the station, the Revenant, anything and anyone in the structural envelope, would cease to exist in any meaningful physical sense. Not destroyed, precisely. Unmade. The physics involved were not fully understood and the engineers who built the system had used the word dissolution in their documentation and then retired, Holt suspected, to drink heavily. He understood why Command had done it this way. If the crew had known, they would have looked for a way out. They would have spent hours on it. Hours that the gate needed defending, and the gate had to be defended because the Heth armada was coming, and if it came through, then the inner colonies, 40 million people, maybe more, were 4 days from the same outcome as Viren 4. Command had calculated the equation, found the answer, and decided that 5 people who had already accepted the possibility of dying in defense of those 40 million were an acceptable component of the solution. Command was not wrong. That was the part that sat in Holt's chest like a stone. He cleared the terminal screen, stood up, and walked out into the corridor where Oriogabel was running systems checks on gun emplacement 3 and whistling something tuneless to himself, and Holt stopped and watched him for a moment, the young man's hands moving over the calibration panel with the focused precision of someone who had trained for this and was glad to be useful, and felt the weight of what he knew settle into place like armor. Heavy. Necessary. His to carry alone. How's she looking? Holt asked. Clean. Somebody maintained these properly. Oriogabel patted the side of the emplacement with genuine affection. Good gun. Good, Holt said. Keep going. He went to find the others and assign watch rotations, and he told no one. The Heth fleet appeared on sensors at the beginning of the 3rd hour. They did not appear gradually, the way a fleet crossing normal space appears, first as faint contacts at the edge of detection range, growing slowly, giving you time. They appeared all at once, because they had been holding position in fold space on the other side of the gate, and then they stopped holding and came through in a single continuous wave, and the sensors screamed. Holt was in the operations room when the alert hit. Nix was beside him before the second tone sounded. She moved between states of rest and combat readiness with no apparent transition, like a switch thrown, and behind her came Oren and then Davin and then Oriogabel at a run, still pulling on his secondary vest. The main display showed the gate aperture filling with contacts. Not 10. Not 20. The sensor interpretation system cycled through its classifications and landed on a number that made Davin say, very quietly, oh. 114 capital ships. Escorts beyond reliable count. They were already deploying into formation, the way a professional force deploys, without hesitation, without the small shuffling adjustments of a fleet that is uncertain of its objective. Transmit contact report to command, Holt said. Oren was already at the communications panel. Transmitting. 7-hour lag. Transmit anyway. Yes, Sergeant. Gun emplacements. Davin, Oriogabel, outer ring, emplacements 1 through 3. Nix, you're with me on 4 through 6. Oren, you stay on sensors and communications and you tell me everything you see. Sergeant, said Oriogabel, who had finished with his vest and was now very still in the way that very young soldiers become very still when what they train for stops being theoretical. There are 114. I know how many there are, Holt said. Move. They moved. Gun emplacement 4 was cold when Holt dropped into the seat and his hands found the power cycle from memory, and the system came up with the particular rising whine of charging capacitors that he associated, in some deep wordless part of himself, with the moment before everything begins. Through the targeting scope the gate was a vast luminous circle against the dark, and through it, still coming through it, a continuous slow tide, were the silhouettes of the Heth warships. They were not elegant. Heth engineering did not prize elegance. Their ships were dense and flat and heavily armored, built for the kind of sustained close-range punishment that their military doctrine favored, and even at this distance the scale of them was wrong in the way that the gate itself was wrong, too large, somehow, for the mind to fully accept. The first Heth scout reached engagement range at 0318 hours. It was a small ship by Heth standards, a picket vessel sent forward to test the station's defenses, and when Holt's first shot hit it amidships and the secondary explosions warped themselves along the hull until the reactor let go, the light was white and total, and for a moment the gate itself was lost behind it. Then the rest of them started shooting back. The outer ring held. It held because Davin was a better shot than she had any right to be for someone whose training was in hydraulics, and because Oriogabel had the specific gift of spatial awareness under fire that no amount of training could instill. He could feel the angles, feel where the next shot was coming from a half second before it arrived, and he moved himself and his targeting accordingly with a fluency that Holt recognized as the real thing. The thing that either existed in a soldier or didn't. It held because Oren, from the operations room, was running threat prioritization continuously and feeding targeting data to all 5 emplacements so that nobody was shooting at the same contact twice. And it held because Nix fought the way Nix always fought, which was with a cold geometric precision that Holt had watched enough times to know came not from the absence of emotion but from something harder, the channeling of enormous feeling into each individual trigger pull, so that every shot she fired meant something she was not saying out loud. The Heth picket force was 12 vessels. By the end of the first 40 minutes it was 3, and those 3 had pulled back to the main fleet formation, which was still sorting itself behind the gate aperture in a way that Holt recognized from briefings as a pre-assault staging pattern. They were not panicked by the picket's losses. They had not expected the picket to take the station. The picket had been information gathering, and now they had the information. Holt checked the clock in the operations room when he came back in to consult with Oren. 4 hours and 11 minutes remaining. They're going to send a strike package, Oren said. He had his sleeves rolled up and there were circles under his eyes that hadn't been there this morning. Probably 8 to 12 ships. Fast movers. They'll try to disable the emplacements before the main assault. How long before they launch? 20 minutes. Maybe 30. Holt stood at the console and looked at the tactical display. The station's emplacements could handle a strike package of that size, possibly, if the crew was sharp and the shots were clean and the Heth didn't do anything unpredictable. After the strike package, the main assault would come. Capital ships at engagement range against a station that was, fundamentally, 400 meters of pressurized tube with 6 guns bolted to it. 3 hours and 40 minutes after that, approximately, whatever remained of Checkpoint Omega and its crew would be rendered irrelevant by the automatic closing sequence, and the gate would collapse, and the Heth armada would be stranded on the far side of a spatial structure that no longer existed. Assuming the station lasted 3 hours and 40 more minutes. Hold the emplacements as long as we can, Holt said. When we lose the outer ring, we fall back to inner defense positions and hold the operations room. The gate mechanism has its own structural shielding. If we can keep them from breaching the core section, we hold. Oren looked at him for a moment with the look of a man who has done the math and knows what the math says. And then we've done our job, Holt said. Keep watching the sensors. He went to check on Oriogabel, whose emplacement had taken a glancing hit from the last exchange and who was lying on his back inside the housing unit making adjustments with a multitool and swearing in what Holt believed was Catalan. It's fine, Oriogabel said, without Holt asking. The motivator mount took a partial. I can have it running in 8 minutes. You have 5. Then I'll have it in 5. He sat up and looked at Holt with those dark eyes that were too old for his face, or maybe not, maybe the face was just young. Sergeant. How bad is it? It's bad, Holt said, because Oriogabel was not a child and did not deserve to be spoken to like one. We can hold. Can we win? Holt looked at him. We're not here to win. We're here to hold. Oriogabel nodded, slowly, with the air of someone accepting an equation. Then he went back under the housing and kept working, and Holt heard him, very quietly, not swearing anymore, talking to himself in the way that soldiers sometimes do, a soft continuous murmur, not words exactly, more like the sound a person makes when they are keeping themselves company in the dark. Holt left him to it. The strike package came at 0341 hours. 11 ships, as Oren had predicted, moving in a staggered formation that made them difficult to sequence on targeting. They were fast. Heth fast movers were built on a different chassis from their capital ships, long and narrow and aggressively streamlined for a species that had started their space program in a denser atmosphere than Earth's, and they came in from 3 vectors simultaneously, which meant the 6 emplacements had to split their attention and coordination became the difference between holding and dying. Davin took one on her own in the first 90 seconds, a clean shot through the drive assembly that sent it spinning off its attack line, and Nix took 2 more in rapid succession, each shot placed with a specific economy of someone who has decided that the first shot has to be the last shot and has made the geometry of the situation agree with that decision. Oriogabel took 1. Holt took 2. The remaining 5 broke off at close range and raked the outer ring with suppression fire before pulling back, and emplacement 2, Davin's secondary position, went dark. Davin. Holt on the comm. Static. Then, I'm okay. The housing's gone but the system is physically intact. I'm pulling the panel, I can hardwire the trigger. Do it. Already doing it. Emplacement 6 took a partial hit that knocked Nix's targeting system offline, and she switched to manual without missing a shot, which Holt noted and did not remark on because remarkable things become ordinary when they happen often enough. Oren, from the operations room, called contacts with a steady rhythm that he maintained even when one of the strike ships came close enough that its weapons wash-lit the station's outer sensors with readings that showed hull temperature rising fast enough to matter. When the strike package withdrew, for ships left of 11, and those 4 badly damaged, Holt did a head count. 5 people. 5 people still functional. He allowed himself exactly nothing about what that meant, because meaning was a thing for after. The main fleet moved forward at 0409. The next 2 hours were not a battle in any tactical sense. They were an attrition. The Heth capital ships did not rush. They moved forward in measured increments, sending fire ahead of them in waves, not precision fire, not targeted, just volume, the way you'd use a hose, and absorbed the station's return fire with the composure of a force that knows it has more ships than the enemy has ammunition and is willing to wait for that math to resolve. Emplacement 3 went dark at 0431, the housing physically destroyed by a hit that took a section of outer ring with it. Oriogabel evacuated the position with 14 seconds to spare and a gash along his left arm from fragmented panel casing that he wrapped with tape from his kit and did not mention again. Emplacement 5 went at 0447. No one was in it. Emplacement 1, Daven's primary position, the one she'd hardwired after the strike package, held until 0503, at which point Holt ordered her back to the inner corridor because the outer ring was compromised on 3 sides and holding position in it any longer was dying for a quarter-kilometer of tube that no longer mattered. They converged on the inner corridor in pairs. Daven and Oriogabel. Oren from the operations room, carrying a portable sensor unit he detached from the main console because it would still tell them what was coming even after the main display went dark. Holt and Nix from the surviving emplacements, 4 and 6 respectively, coming in from opposite ends of the inner ring and meeting at the central junction. Nix looked at him when they met. Just looked. Then she looked away and started checking her weapon, and Holt let his eyes go to the clock on the operations room display, visible through the open doorway. 2 hours and 17 minutes. He thought, we can hold 2 hours and 17 minutes. He thought, we have to hold 2 hours and 17 minutes. He thought, briefly and with a specificity he did not allow himself to linger on, we will hold 2 hours and 17 minutes because there is no alternative to holding 2 hours and 17 minutes, and when those 2 hours and 17 minutes are done, the gate will close, and 40 million people will still be alive, and whoever decided that this was the acceptable solution was, on the coldest accounting, not wrong. He went to help Oren set up the portable sensor unit and did not think about it anymore. At 0521, with 1 hour and 36 minutes remaining, the Heth began boarding attempts. They sent cutting crews, small teams in armored suits with thermal lances, against the outer hull of the inner section, not the operations room, which had additional shielding, but the corridor junctions to either side of it. 2 points simultaneously. The kind of approach that assumed a small defensive force would have to split itself to respond to both, which was correct. Oren, you stay on sensors, Holt said. Oriogabel, take Daven and hold Junction 7. Nix, you're with me on Junction 4. How many suits are they putting through? Daven asked. Oren. Thermal reads 4 at each point. Possibly 5. 4 each, Holt said. Move. Junction 4 was a 90-degree corner in the corridor approximately 60 meters from the operations room, which gave Holt and Nix a natural choke point and a killing ground of about 20 meters between the corner and the nearest cover position the boarders could use once they were through the hull. The Heth cutting teams were methodical. Holt could hear the lance working through the outer hull, a sound like a high-pitched continuous scream, climbing in register as the metal gave way, and he used the time to position Nix at the corner and himself 10 meters back where he could cover her and see the approach from 2 directions. When they breach, he said. I know, she said. The breach came at 0528. The hull section folded inward in a rough oval and 4 Heth soldiers came through in rapid succession, already firing, using their entry momentum as cover in the way that Heth boarding doctrine dictated. They were large. The Heth were large, heavier boned than humans, wearing armor that was functionally a wearable vehicle, and they moved with the specific compressed physicality of a species that had developed in 1.3 standard gravities and did not find corridors confining. Nix killed the first one before it was fully through the breach. She killed the second one at the same time Holt killed the third. The fourth made it to a section of corridor housing and exchanged fire with Holt for approximately 4 seconds before Nix moved laterally in a way that took her out of cover and into the open and shot it through the visor. You don't have to do that, Holt said. It was there, she said. From Junction 7, the sounds of a firefight. Daven's voice on the comm, 2 down, 2 down. Oriogabel's hit. Holt, how bad? Oriogabel's voice, I'm okay. Left leg. I can walk. Can you fight? A pause. Yeah. Hold the junction. They held the junction. 3 more breach attempts came over the next 40 minutes, each of them probing a different section of the inner ring, trying to find a weak point or divide the response. There were 5 people to cover 6 potential breach points, and Holt rotated them by threat priority the way you moved pieces on a board, except that the pieces were people he'd served with for over a year and the consequences of miscalculation were specific and irreversible. He made no miscalculations. Oren called contacts with a portable unit and fed him data, and he moved people accordingly, and the junction at 4 held, and junction 7 held, and at 060 for the Heth withdrew their boarding teams. They withdrew them and began a direct assault on the outer hull with capital ship weapons at close range. The station shook. Not the kind of shaking that comes from weapons fire at distance, that was a steady rhythmic vibration you learn to tune out, but the deep structural shuddering of something being hit by forces it was not built to absorb indefinitely. Holt felt it in his teeth and in the soles of his feet. A section of ceiling in the inner corridor cracked along a seam and then held. The lighting went from white to emergency amber. Oren reported that outer ring sections 2 through 5 had lost pressure integrity, which was fine because there was nobody in them, and then reported that the gate mechanism's structural shielding was holding, which was what mattered. Oriogabel made it back to the operations room on his own, dragging his left leg but making it. He sat down on the floor with his back against the console base and started field dressing the wound properly, unwrapping the tape and doing it right, and Davin sat down beside him with a supply kit and did it for him instead, and the two of them were very quiet in the particular way of soldiers who have been through the same fire and don't need to say so. 1 hour and 2 minutes remaining when Nix found Holt alone. He was in the corridor outside the operations room, checking a pressure seal that didn't need checking, doing it with his hands because his hands needed something to do. The station was shaking with a low continuous regularity now. The amber light made everything look like the inside of something burning. He heard her come to a stop behind him and he did not turn around. "Tell me the truth," Nick said. He worked the seal another half-turn with the wrench. "About what?" "You know about what?" He stopped. He stood with his back to her and his hands on the seal that didn't need checking and the wrench handle in his fist, and he thought about the lie available to him, the simple denial, the redirect, the flat assertion that there was nothing to tell, and he knew, in the way that he had known from the moment he first noticed her watching his face in the operations room and understood what she was seeing there, that the lie would not work. Not with her. She had grown up reading two species. She had learned human faces against the backdrop of Heth ones, which meant she noticed everything a human face did not say. He put the wrench down on the deck. He turned around. Her amber eyes were steady on his face. No accusation in them. Not yet. Just the question, and the certainty beneath the question, and beneath that a stillness that was the stillness of someone who has already accepted that the answer will be something they are not going to like. "The gate closes in 58 minutes, Holt said. "Automatically. Command set the sequence 18 hours ago. I found it in the second hour." She said nothing. "There is no override. The comlag is 7 hours. We are inside the aperture radius." She looked at him. The amber light made her orbital ridges sharper, more pronounced, and for a moment she looked entirely like what she half was, and Holt thought of Viren 4 and what she'd lost to arrive at this corridor in this station with this information, and the thought sat in him like a blade. "Why didn't you tell us?" she said. It was not quite a question. "You know why. Because we'd have looked for a way out." "There is no way out. The Revenant is inside the radius." "There is no," he stopped. "There is one escape pod. Single occupancy. It's mounted on the outer ring section 1, which is the only section that's still structurally intact. The pod has a thermal shield rated for gate dissolution proximity, which is why it wasn't stripped for the station upgrade. It was deemed non-mission critical." He met her eyes. "I've known about it since the beginning." The silence that followed was long. Through the wall the station shook and the amber light flickered, and somewhere in the distance the capital ship's weapons hit something structural and the whole tube groaned. "One pod," Nick said. "Yes. And you didn't tell us." "If I told you, we'd have spent 4 hours fighting about who goes. We'd have fought the Heth with our attention split. We might not have held. Who did you decide to put in it?" "I haven't decided." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, you have." He didn't answer. "You decided it wasn't going to be you," she said. "You decided it was one of us. You just haven't worked out which one yet. And you couldn't tell us because you couldn't face us knowing that one person was going to live, and you've been sitting on that for 4 hours. That's not," he stopped again, because she was right and he knew she was right, and the only question remaining was whether being right made it better or worse. "If I'd told you, Oriogabel would have argued for one of us to take it. Davin would have done the same. You would have." "I'd have argued for you to take it," she said, quietly. He looked at her. "You have children," she said. "2. I've seen the photos in your kit. A girl and a boy. The girl has your eyes. I don't have anyone left who would notice. My father is gone. My mother's people did it." She said this plainly, the way you state weather conditions, as if the devastation of the fact had been worked over so many times it had achieved a kind of smoothness. "The math is not complicated." It's not your math to do. Then whose is it? Commands. They've already done it. She stepped forward until she was very close to him in the amber corridor. Tell the others, Marcus. He said nothing. Tell them. Give them the hour. It doesn't matter now, the gate is going to close in 58 minutes. The emplacements are gone. We hold this corridor until the sequence triggers. Telling them doesn't cost us the gate. And they deserve to know. She looked at him steadily. They have been fighting for something they thought was an assignment. Let them know it was a choice. He looked at her for a long time. The station shook. The light flickered. The clock moved. Then he said, "Okay," and went into the operations room to tell them. Oriogabel was the first one to speak, after. He said, 40 minutes. He said it with a kind of flat factual clarity that was almost nothing, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay," in a voice that was much younger and was not trying to be otherwise. Davin stood up from where she'd been sitting beside him. She didn't say anything. She walked to the sensor console and looked at the tactical display, the fleet positions, the gate status, the countdown, and stood there for about 30 seconds, and then she came back and sat down again. Oren looked at the floor. He had a photograph in his kit that Holt knew about and had never asked about, because soldiers' private photographs are private, and he held it now without looking at it, just held it in his lap with his fingers on the edges. Nix leaned against the corridor doorway and watched the operations room as a whole, the way she always did, covering the space, reading it, attending to all of it at once. "The pod," Davin said finally. "1," Holt said. "Okay." She looked at Oriogabel, who was looking at the ceiling. "Tomos." He shook his head before she finished. "Don't. You're the youngest. Don't." He said it again without moving his eyes from the ceiling. "I came here. I knew what we were here for. I'm not leaving because I'm younger." He paused. "And if you try to make me, I'll be very upset with you." It came out with so much plain dignity that nobody said anything for a moment. "It should be Holt," Nick said. "We've had this discussion," Holt said. "Holt has children," Nick said, to the room. "Nix," said Holt. "2 children. A daughter and a son. He has a photograph. The daughter has his eyes." "Nix." "He should take the pod," she said, and her voice was entirely level, the way the surface of water is level when the current beneath is fast. "That's what I think. I am putting it to the group." Nobody spoke. The station groaned. The amber light held. "I don't want to take it," Holt said, which was not quite the same as refusing. "I know," Nick said. "That's not the criterion." Oriogabel said, from the floor, "There are 40 million people on the other side of this gate, Sergeant." He still hadn't moved his eyes from the ceiling. "You make it home. You go home and I don't know, you tell your daughter about this place. About Omega. That's worth something. That's what the other side of this is for." He paused. "It's all right." Holt stood in the middle of the operations room and looked at each of them in turn. Davin, who was looking back at him with her jaw set and her eyes very bright and steady. Oren, who had the photograph in his lap and was not crying but was close to it and not embarrassed about being close to it. Oriogabel on the floor, young and calm and certain. Nix in the doorway. "I'll go to the pod when there are 5 minutes left," Holt said. "Not before. I hold this corridor with you." "Yes," said Nix. "Until 5 minutes." "Yes." He sat down on the floor against the opposite wall from Oriogabel, and after a moment Davin sat down between them, and Oren after her, and Nix came in from the doorway and sat as well, and for approximately 8 minutes, while the Heth fleet continued its assault on the outer hull and the station continued to shake and the clock continued to move, the 5 of them sat together on the floor of the operations room of Checkpoint Omega and talked. Davin told them about the lake where she grew up, on Callum's world, which had water so cold in summer that it turned your feet numb in under a minute. She had jumped into it every morning from age 7 to age 17, she said, because her grandmother had told her it built character, and she was not entirely convinced it had, but she'd kept doing it anyway because her grandmother was old enough that contradicting her felt like bad odds. Oren said he had never been swimming in his life. He'd grown up on a station, Meridian, same as where they departed, and he'd never once been planetside until training. He said water from a faucet still felt like a miracle. He said his partner was waiting for him at Meridian, and that he'd sent a message on the way here, and that the message would arrive in about 6 days and wouldn't make sense to read given what would already have happened. He said it anyway. He'd said the things he wanted to say. That was enough. Oriogabel told them about his mother's cooking, specifically her arroz con leche, which he described with a nostalgic precision that became something close to prayer. The texture of it, the cinnamon on top, the specific ceramic bowl she always used that had a chip in the rim that nobody had ever bothered to replace. He talked about it for 4 minutes and then stopped and was quiet and seemed to feel better. Nix did not offer a memory. When it came to her, they were going around, taking turns, without quite having decided to, she said. I've been part of 2 species my whole life and neither of them entirely claimed me. This one came close. She looked at the floor. This one came close. The 5 of us, this year. That's the closest. Nobody said anything. Then Davin reached over and put her hand briefly over Nix's hand, which was resting on the floor, and Nix looked at Davin's hand and then looked away and swallowed once. Holt was last. He talked about his daughter, whose name was Lena and who was 7 and who had a specific laugh that he could reproduce in his memory with complete fidelity, the precise sound of it, the frequency, the way it made her whole face work. He talked about his son, Bram, who was 4 and who had recently developed strong opinions about which socks were acceptable to wear, which had become the source of considerable negotiation every morning. He talked for a while and then stopped. He thought there might have been more to say and found that there wasn't, or that what was left didn't have the shape of words. At 0641, 4 minutes and 30 seconds before the sequence, the Heth boarding crews came back. They came through 3 points at once, which meant they had been waiting for the station's resistance to thin, and they had been patient enough to wait for the right moment, and the right moment was now. Holt had his rifle in his hands before the second breach alert sounded and Nix was already moving and he understood, in the specific calculus of the corridor, that there were not enough of them to hold 3 points. He held the operations room doorway. Nix took the corridor. Davin and Oren flanked her. Oriogabel, who could not put full weight on his left leg, braced against the frame of the sensor console and covered the rear approach from emplacement access point 6 and did not miss once. The Heth came in heavy, more soldiers than before, fully armored, pressing forward through their own casualties with the grim purposeful momentum of a force that has been given a time limit and intends to meet it. Holt shot 2 in the initial breach and then 2 more in the corridor proper and then a 5th that had almost reached the doorway. He was aware, during this, of the countdown on the console display behind him. He was aware of it in the way you are aware of something that is happening in the same space as everything else that is happening, part of the same continuous present moment, contributing to its urgency without yet dominating it. 3 minutes. Nix fought the center of the corridor with a ferocity that was not loud. It was never loud with Nix, but that had a quality of absolute finality to it, as if she had decided that nothing was getting past her, not because she could guarantee it but because she would simply not allow the alternative to happen. She took a hit along the right shoulder that spun her half around and she returned to position and kept going. 2 minutes. Davin went down. Not dead, she was moving, trying to get back up, but down and out of the fight for the moment. Oren covered her and the corridor narrowed in terms of what it could hold. Go, Nix said to Holt, without looking at him. He did not move. Sergeant. She said it without inflection, the way you say a fact. 90 seconds. He looked at her. He looked at the corridor. He looked at Oriogabel, who had seen him looking and who nodded once, and at Oren, who was firing down the corridor with a steadiness that Holt had not known was in him and did not look up. Davin was on one knee now, getting back up, bleeding from somewhere on her head but getting up. He moved. He went down the inner corridor at a run, the section of outer ring that was still intact, the pod mounted on its release mechanism, the amber light strobing now as systems failed, and he could hear the firefight behind him, could hear it over his comms, which he had not turned off because he was not ready to stop hearing them. He reached the pod bay. The pod was single occupancy, white, smaller than he remembered from the schematic but present, real, with its release lever on the right side and its thermal plating gleaming under the failing lights. He stopped. He stood at the pod bay entrance for 4 seconds. Then his hands made a decision and he began to move. The gate closed at 0645 hours and 47 seconds, which was 3 seconds before the automated sequence had it scheduled, and the reason for the discrepancy is unknown and unlikely to ever be understood. The Kessler gate mechanism had been in standby for 8 hours. When the closing sequence triggered, it did not do so gradually. The field that maintained the aperture, the knotted spatial structure that allowed passage between 2.70 light-years apart, collapsed inward from its outer edge, pulling the geometry of local space with it in a cascade that nothing in the aperture radius survived. The physics involved used the word dissolution in their documentation, and the documentation was accurate. The station did not explode. It did not burn. It simply ceased. 114 Heth capital ships on the far side of the gate, committed to transit, with their formation arranged for assault, found themselves stranded. The spatial structure they had transited through no longer existed. The aperture through which they had planned to send their fleet into the inner colonies was not damaged or blocked. It was not there. The point in space where it had been was ordinary space, empty and unremarkable, and the Heth armada hung in it for 6 hours of communication silence before the first strategic withdrawal orders came through. The inner colonies did not fall. 40 million people woke that morning and made coffee and argued with their children about breakfast, and none of them knew why they would live out the rest of their lives in the particular quiet of safety that is only quiet because the noise that would have ended it happened somewhere else, far away, in the dark. 14 days later, a coalition search and recovery vessel following the gate dissolution coordinates found one object in the debris field. It was an escape pod, single occupancy, of the type rated for gate dissolution proximity events, tumbling in a slow rotation that suggested it had been released in the last seconds before the collapse. It was sealed. It was intact. Its thermal plating had done what thermal plating of that rating was designed to do. The recovery team brought it aboard and cut the seal from outside and opened it. Inside were 2 people. One of them was breathing. The reader knows which 2 were in that pod. The reader has been in the corridor with them, in the amber light, and has heard the things each person said and has understood what each person was capable of giving. The reader knows which one of them, in the last 90 seconds, picked up the wrench that was still lying on the floor of the corridor outside the operations room, the wrench that had been left there when the conversation was interrupted and the battle resumed, and made a decision with the deliberate, clear-eyed irreversibility of someone who had already accepted the equation and was only choosing, now, which term of it to be. The pod is tumbling in the dark. There are 2 people inside it. One of them, when the seal is cut and the light comes in, will open their eyes. That is enough. That is, against all the accounting that brought them here, more than enough.